Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast, and welcome to our first video podcast. This is my first time ever doing this, so you'll have to forgive me if maybe the video doesn't look so great. I'm not a video editor or anything like that, but hopefully it goes well, and we'll see what we do from here. Last week, as we closed out, I said that I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go with our study, whether we would study one of the gospel accounts or maybe the book of James. I really wanted to study the book of James. You'll see that as we go through this lesson. I reference it a couple times. I decided what I really want to do is I really want us to understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. So today we're going to be beginning a series that I just entitled Discipleship, in which our text is going to come from Galatians chapter 5 and 6. Sometimes when we talk about discipleship or following the disciplines of the Christian life, the discussion turns into all the things that you do to try to be a follower of Jesus. Lessons are given that tell us that we need to pray more, study the Bible more, worship more, and things like that. But then we struggle with doing these things and wonder why we're having a hard time in these disciplines. And I don't think that this is the right way to look at our walk with God. These things are important and they're necessary. They're given to us by God, but I believe that this might be, it's best described as putting the cart before the horse. I think an important place for us to learn about discipleship and our walk with Jesus is to spend some time in the Apostle Paul's writings to the Galatians, where he explains what this walk will look like in our lives. Sometimes we can jump right into the fruit of the Spirit or the works of the flesh, but there is an important introduction to this lesson that Paul teaches. Before Paul begins to describe what this walk is all about, he first wants us to understand what is going on in our lives and what is at stake. So let's turn in our copies of God's Word to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16 is where we're going to start. And this will be where we start our study. Verse 16 says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh." I want us to consider what Paul is saying just here in verse 16. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. These should be exciting words for us to hear. It is possible to not carry out the desires of the flesh. Sometimes we can be so dismayed about our struggle against sin, we should be upset by our failures and have a desire to do better. What I want us to see is that this is a winnable war. This is not an impossible journey. Our walk with God is not set up as a completely impossible venture. Paul is going to explain how we can do this, but he begins by just describing two sides: living your life by the Spirit or carrying out the desires of your flesh. This is an important starting point. You have you have desires that you're not supposed to fulfill. There are things that, you're going to want to do that you just can't do. You're going to have unfulfilled desires. The world says that if you have a desire, then you have to fulfill that desire. If you want to do it, just do it. Unfortunately, people don't think about the logical outcome, which is the fruit of our culture. Right now, I will harm you because I want to. I desire to harm you because that's just the way I feel. We see this in our national news all the time, but hey, just fulfill your desires. Break the law, destroy property, hurt others, get upset, get what you deserve, get what belongs to you and do what you want. Listen to what Paul tells us. There are things you want to do that you must not do. God is saying you cannot do everything that you want to do. And being a parent, this is why we don't let our kids do what they want. We as parents are teaching our children that just because you want to do something and just because you have a desire does not mean that you get to have it or to do it. this is training them up in righteousness. That's a whole nother topic. We won't even get into that today. So moving on to verse 17 here in Galatians 5, it says, for the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, and the desires of the spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. I hope I'm not the only one that feels this way, but do you ever feel like there is a war going on within yourself? Paul says that we're right to feel that way. The desires of the flesh are opposed to the desires of the spirit. The desires of the spirit are opposed to the desires of the flesh. Our fleshly urges and desires are warring against our will to do what God wants us to do. And, we need to hear these words, that there is a war going on within us. There is a conflict going on inside of us. You have two sets of desires that are incompatible, and these two sets of desires do not exist peacefully with each other. It's important to see this war. We're not in a passive situation. There is a conflict going on. One of the problems we face is that we try to make these desires work together. We try to mesh the desires of the spirit with the desires of the flesh. We try to make them work together. And I want us to listen to the Apostle Paul. These two desires, they cannot exist together. Look carefully at verse 17. For these are opposed to each other, is what it says. Do not try to make these things work together. They can't work together. I think this is the cause for many miserable Christians. Miserable Christians are those who want to gratify all these fleshly desires while at the same time follow the desires of the Spirit. So we try to do right, but we feel miserable because we want to gratify our desires. So then we gratify our desires only to become miserable because the guilt we feel for not following the desires of the Spirit. It's just, it's a life of misery as you sit in the middle of these two warring desires. This was the point of the Apostle Paul made to the Ephesians. In Ephesians 4:22 through 24, it says, you were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lusts, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourselves with the new self, created according to the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Notice that Paul, he uses this imagery of clothing. You are not taught to keep both of these warring selves. You were taught to take off the former way of life, be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and clothe yourselves with the new self. It's not comfortable, at least to me, it's not comfortable to wear two sets of clothing. Too often what we try to do is put on the new self, created in righteousness and holiness, without taking off the old clothes that are corrupt and they're deluded by lusts. We just put those righteous clothes over the top of our filthy clothes, and we're miserable and nothing seems right. So we live life as miserable Christians. Or we finally cast off the new self and go back to the old self because it feels more comfortable. Paul is expressing a reality for us to consider. We're either living in one sphere or we're living in the other. You're carrying out the desires of the flesh or you're carrying out the desires of the Spirit. It's not just simply saying no to sin and doing what is right. You're either living in one realm or the other. You may be miserable in one realm or the other because of the battle that goes on within each of us. But at the end of the day, we're either walking by the Spirit or we're walking by the flesh. One of these desires is ruling our lives. One of these desires is in charge of us. One of these desires controls all of our decision making. This is the point at the end of verse 17 in Galatians 5. It says to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. The desires of the flesh are incompatible and are keeping you from doing the things you want to do. I think this is the right way to understand this text. I don't believe that it makes sense for Paul to be speaking about unbelievers who are being kept from doing sinful things by the desires of the Spirit. Unbelievers, they don't have this war going on within them. They just do what they want to do. The only conflict is either, the law, the teaching of their parents, or their conscience. Rather, Paul is writing to Christians, telling them that you have a war between your fleshly desires and what you ought to do. Being led in the Spirit keeps us from following the desires of the flesh. So where does this war come from? Sometimes we can mistakenly believe that this war and the problems we're having, fighting against these problems that we have, fighting against the desires of the flesh, they come from outside of us. But the scriptures never say that the problem it's out there in the world, and if you could just isolate yourself from the world, you'd do so much better, and you wouldn't sin. The scriptures never say isolate by yourself and then you'll not sin. The scriptures never say to isolate with other righteous men or other righteous women and then you'll never sin. The reason why is because the problem is not outside of us, but it's within us. Listen to what James said in James 1 and verse 14. It says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire." Isolation will not do any good because the problem, it's in our hearts. The world is not the problem because the problem is within us. We're lured and enticed by our own desires. That's the issue. We can destroy all of our tech, say buy to Facebook, Instagram. We can sell all of our possessions, quit our jobs, and go out and sit on a hill, and we're still going to have sinful desires. And we'll still sin. The problem is the heart. We sometimes attempt to find freedom the wrong way. Freedom is not through willpower or through isolation, but freedom is possible. Notice in Galatians 5:18, it says, "But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." If you're led by the Spirit, you're going to have freedom. This is the parallel to what was said back in verse 16. If you're led by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. You've been called to freedom. That's back in verse 13. If you're led by the Spirit, you will not be under the condemnation of the law when sinful fruit is produced. There is freedom, not to sin, but to serve the desires of the Spirit. I think this is a very important consideration for this winnable war. First, we do not see that we are enslaved by our passions and desires. I've been teaching Bible classes now for a couple years. I've talked to countless people who are struggling with sin, not necessarily within our church, but also friends outside of church that have been struggling with sin and they've been caught up in their vices. I've talked to people captured by pornography. I've talked to people who have cheated in their relationships. I've talked to people who have given in to drunkenness. And I've asked these people why they're doing what they're doing. And do you know what the typical answer is? They typically answer, "Well, Dustin, I don't know. Why are you meeting these women? I don't know. Why are you cheating on your spouse or your girlfriend or boyfriend? I don't know. Why are you sleeping around? I don't know. Why are you into pornography? Why do you drink? I don't know." And here, to me, is what "I don't know" means. It means I am captured by my desires. The reason you're doing what you don't understand is because you're captured by your desires. You're enslaved to these vices and sins. Your flesh cries out so loudly that you give into it repeatedly and mindlessly. It gets to such a point that you believe that you can never stop. And this happens, oh, so subtly. It's just a sin here and there, but then this beast is unleashed and it feels like there is no longer the ability to have control. The urge becomes greater than our willpower. So the answer is, I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. And this is true for all sins. Why are you angry with people and have outbursts of wrath? You're controlled by your flesh, obeying your fleshly desires. And secondly, we don't see that the desires of the Spirit are the way to be set free from these passions. What we miss is that freedom is available. Freedom comes from being led by the desires of the Spirit. You're not going to be free if you keep gratifying the desires of the flesh. The temptation tells you that you will be free, you will be better, you'll be happy, and you are for a few hours. But then the desires of the flesh, what do? They rise up again, and you're right back where you were earlier. You're enslaved to your flesh. Your flesh controls you. The only freedom available is by seeing that these desires are in conflict with the desires of the Spirit. Look to verse 16 again. It says, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. In other words, you'll be free from your slavery if you'll walk by the Spirit and follow the desires of the Spirit. So what is the takeaway for our lives as we consider discipleship? First takeaway, I think, is that this is a winnable war. You don't have to be enslaved. You don't have to gratify your fleshly desires. You're not doomed to having your flesh rule over your life. It's not a hopeless situation to try to follow Jesus. It's not a miserable situation to follow Jesus. We make it this way because we don't put the old self to death. We stay enslaved while trying to put the new clothes over the top of our old sinful clothes. And our second takeaway, I think, should be a Christian is someone who is at war against these fleshly desires. Be concerned if you don't feel that war raging within you. If you're not feeling the conflict, then you have become comfortable with your sins. Be concerned if you're complacent in your sins. When temptation comes, there should be a fight as our desires for the Spirit go to war with the fleshly desires. This is what Paul warned about happening back over in Ephesians again. In Ephesians 4 and verse 19, it says, they have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greed, to practice every kind of impurity. The heart, it can become callous, no longer caring about the ways of the Lord if we don't feel the war. But the situation isn't hopeless. The war is still winnable by by the transforming power of God. But I want you to see, the grave spiritual danger you're in if you don't feel this conflict. You're deeply enslaved, and I want you to see the chains that are binding you. Your heart can be softened if you will let the Lord work on your heart and in your life. We have to start by giving ourselves to the desires of the Spirit, and we will see the changes that begin in us. I'm really excited about this study on discipleship. I hope you are too. I'm really excited also about the video podcast. I'm not sure how many weeks I've been doing this, but you've never seen my face, not on Instagram or Facebook or anything like that. But I hope that as we go through the study of discipleship, that we understand what it means, what it truly means to be a disciple of Jesus. And I hope that as we go through it, that you study on your own. Don't just listen to what I say, but read it and take it in for yourself. Pray through it. And as always, I hope to see you back next week. If you would give the podcast a like, share, and subscribe. And until our next sharpening session, stay steadfast, stay inspired, and may your faith continue to grow sharper each day. This is the Iron Sharpens Iron Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Goad. And until next week, God bless.